for one thing, regionalization is not a new concept for our church. It goes all the way back to 1924 when it was proposed that the U.S. become a central conference. And it really picked up steam in the 1990s when central conferences began to say, U.S. dominates General Conference and there's too much U.S. specific legislation there. And so there were several proposals that had occurred during that time period between the 90s and now. We even passed legislation in 2008 to change the Constitution, but then that wasn't ratified. The current legislation has its roots in the General Conference asking the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters to develop a general book of discipline that would define what is adaptable and what is not. And the central conferences have been able to adapt the book of discipline to fit their culture because the book of discipline is so U.S.-centric. There's a lot of things that don't apply outside of the U.S., but there was no specific, this can be adapted and this can't be. And so the General Conference had asked the Standing Committee to look at that. And in the process of doing that, they realized that the U.S. had nowhere to do that adaptable work. And though they recognized that needed to happen along with what was happening with the General Book of Discipline, they didn't have the capacity to do that work. And so that's in 2016, the Connectional Table took on that task. And working with Westpath, we developed legislation that would allow for a U.S., well, it's a two-part process. First of all, it would make an interim committee that would allow the U.S. to deal with legislation. That legislation would have to come back to the General Conference to be approved. And then the second phase of that would be changing the Constitution to allow U.S. to be a regional conference. So that legislation, working with Westpath, because they have a interest in this because a lot of the legislation that's U.S.-centric deals with things like pensions. We'll spend a day at General Conference specifically on pensions materials, so or property matters. Property matters changed by location and countries. So those kinds of things were the interest, and that was the purpose behind this legislation that came. It was submitted in 2019. For the General Conference is in the ADCA, in the original ADCA, and that's one set of legislation that's before us for General Conference, and that's called the U.S. as a Regional Conference. In the winter of 2019 into 2020, a group that had been working together that had its roots in the central conferences took that legislation and expanded it so that regionalization would be so all the central conferences would also become regional conferences. And that group was called they called their legislation the Christmas Covenant. And a lot of people have heard that because in the time since 2020, when it was submitted by the Cavite Annual Conference in the Philippines, because annual conferences have a slightly later deadline to submit legislation, they have worked on promoting that throughout and promoting the idea of regionalization throughout the whole church. So that legislation is a second set of legislation that's available, and it's in the supplement to the ADCA. The Christmas Covenant team came to the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters and said, would you endorse this? And does this fit with what your values are? And so the Standing Committee took a look at that and wanted to make sure that that was the case, that this legislation fit with their values. And so they promoted, they asked the Connectional Table to work with them to just refine it and perfect this legislation. So that group was formed between the Standing Committee and the Connectional Table and included a member of the Christmas Covenant for that input. So that's a third set of legislation, and that's the one that's really being considered most broadly because the Christmas Covenant has now said, yes, we support this legislation. And that is 8 petitions that include, again, the U.S. regional petitions that were originally submitted and then have expanded that for regionalization. And then there's a fourth piece, and that was submitted in time to make the supplement of the ADCA, and it's just a substitute for the first petition. That was done by some people who were associated with the Christmas Covenant, but it is not part of the Christmas Covenant legislation. So that's the legislation that the major legislation that we're considering at this General Conference.